It was called Blackthorn Manor, a crumbling estate that had once been the crown jewel of the countryside, now reduced to little more than a haunting relic of a dark past. For over a century, the house had been abandoned, standing like a silent sentinel on the edge of the village. The locals avoided it at all costs, whispering of the curse that had fallen upon the Blackthorn family, whose name had become synonymous with tragedy and death. But Rebecca wasn't one to believe in curses. As an ambitious historian, with a passion for uncovering the truth behind old legends, Rebecca was drawn to Blackthorn Manor like a moth to a flame. The story of the manor intrigued her. The once powerful Blackthorn family had mysteriously disappeared one night, leaving behind nothing but whispers of dark magic and death. Some said the manor was haunted, that the souls of the Blackthorns still lingered within its decaying walls. Others claimed the house itself was cursed to bring ruin to anyone who dared to enter. Rebecca dismissed it as superstition. To her, Blackthorn Manor was just another piece of history, one that begged to be uncovered. When the opportunity arose to spend a weekend at the manor for research purposes, she eagerly accepted. The drive to Blackthorn was long and eerie, the road winding through dense woods that seemed to swallow the light. As Rebecca approached the manor, the sky darkened, casting the old house in shadow. The building was even more imposing than she had imagined. Its stone walls were covered in ivy, its windows dark and hollow, like eyes staring out into the abyss. She parked her car and stood in front of the iron gates, which creaked open as if welcoming her. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decay, and the wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the faintest whisper of voices. Rebecca hesitated for a moment, but shook off her unease. It was just an old house, she reminded herself. Nothing more. The interior of the manor was a maze of dark corridors and dusty rooms, filled with old furniture covered in sheets. The wallpaper had long since faded, and cobwebs hung from the ceilings like lace. Despite the disrepair, there was something regal about the place, a lingering trace of the grandeur it once held. Rebecca set up her equipment in the library where she had found the family records and journals left behind by the Blackthorns. She spent hours poring over the documents, fascinated by the details of their lives. The Blackthorns had been a wealthy family, but their rise to prominence had been swift and mysterious. Rumors of dark rituals and forbidden practices surrounded them, though nothing had ever been proven. As night fell, Rebecca lit the old candelabras she had found in the manor's kitchen. The flickering light cast long shadows across the room, making the place feel even more haunted. She could hear the wind howling outside, rattling the windows. The sound echoed through the halls, giving the impression that the house itself was groaning. Then came the whispers. At first, Rebecca thought it was just the wind playing tricks on her ears. But as she sat in the library, flipping through an old journal, she distinctly heard her name. Rebecca. She froze, her heart skipping a beat. The voice was faint, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. She stood up, looking around the room, but saw nothing. The air had grown colder, and she could feel a presence, as if someone was standing right behind her. Rebecca. The voice came again, this time louder, more insistent. It seemed to echo from the walls themselves. Rebecca's pulse quickened, and a chill ran down her spine. This wasn't her imagination. Someone, or something, was in the house with her. She grabbed her flashlight and ventured into the hallway, her footsteps echoing through the empty house. The shadows seemed to move with her, shifting and twisting as if alive. She followed the sound of the voice, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The voice, led her to the grand staircase, its once beautiful banister now rotting and splintered. Rebecca hesitated at the foot of the stairs. The darkness above was thick, impenetrable, but the voice, soft and melodic, called to her from somewhere on the upper floor. Against her better judgment, she began to climb. Each step creaked under her weight, the sound echoing through the silent manor. As she reached the top of the stairs, the temperature plummeted. She could see her breath in front of her, and the air was thick with the scent of old wood and something metallic. Blood? The voice grew louder, beckoning her toward a door at the end of the hall. It was slightly ajar, a faint light spilling out from within. Rebecca's heart raced as she approached, her hand trembling as she pushed the door open. Inside was a bedroom, untouched by time. The bed was neatly made, the curtains drawn, and a large mirror hung on the wall opposite the bed. In the center of the room stood a woman. Rebecca gasped, stumbling backward. The woman was pale, her skin nearly translucent, her long black hair hanging down to her waist. She was dressed in an old-fashioned gown, her eyes dark and hollow, and her lips twisted into a sinister smile. "Rebecca," the woman whispered, her voice soft, but filled with malice. Rebecca tried to speak, but her throat was dry. She stepped back, her mind racing. Who was this woman? How did she know her name? "You've come to join us," the woman continued, her smile widening. Rebecca's heart pounded in her chest. She turned to run, but the door slammed shut behind her with a deafening bang. The woman moved closer, her movements slow and deliberate, like a predator stalking its prey. Rebecca backed away until she hit the wall, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The woman's face twisted into something inhuman, her eyes black and empty, her mouth opening wide to reveal sharp, jagged teeth. "You're one of us now!" the woman hissed. Suddenly, the mirror behind the woman cracked, and from its shattered surface, dozens of hands reached out, grasping at Rebecca. They pulled her toward the mirror, their cold, bony fingers digging into her skin. "No!" Rebecca screamed, struggling against their grip, but it was no use. The hands dragged her into the mirror, into the darkness beyond. And then there was silence. The next morning, when the village police arrived at Blackthorn Manor to investigate a break-in, they found no sign of Rebecca. Her car was still parked outside, her belongings scattered in the library. But Rebecca was gone, vanished without a trace. The mirror in the bedroom, however, remained intact, and if you looked closely, you might see a face reflected in the glass, a face twisted in terror, forever trapped in the curse of Blackthorn Manor. Enoch Street was the kind of place people moved to when they wanted to forget about the world. A quiet, narrow road lined with old, weathered houses. It sat on the edge of town, forgotten by time. Few people ventured there, and fewer still talked about it. There were rumors, of course, stories of strange happenings, of people going missing in the dead of night, and of the shadows that seemed to come alive once the sun went down. Simon had heard the stories, but he didn't believe in them. He was a rational man, a private investigator by trade, here to look into the sudden disappearance of an elderly woman named Mrs. Cartwright. She had lived alone on Enoch Street, in the same house for over 50 years, until one night she vanished without a trace. The local authorities had found no signs of a break-in, no evidence of foul play. It was as if she had simply ceased to exist. Her neighbors said they hadn't seen her in days, but no one had heard anything unusual. They were used to keeping their distance. Mrs. Cartwright had been a reclusive woman, rarely seen outside of her home. Simon wasn't one to shy away from a mystery, and the case of Mrs. Cartwright intrigued him. He had been hired by her niece, a woman who lived across the country, to find out what had happened. But when he arrived at Enoch Street, the eerie silence of the place unsettled him. It was late afternoon when Simon arrived, the sky overcast and the air thick with the smell of rain. The houses on Enoch Street were old and tired, their windows dark and lifeless. There was something off about the place, something Simon couldn't quite put his finger on. He parked his car in front of Mrs. Cartwright's house, a small, dilapidated building with peeling paint and overgrown weeds. The door creaked as he pushed it open, and he was immediately hit with the stench of mildew and decay. The inside of the house was dark, the air thick with dust. It looked as if it hadn't been touched in years, despite Mrs. Cartwright having lived there until recently. Simon began his search, methodically checking each room for clues. The house was eerily silent, the only sound the creaking of the floorboards beneath his feet. There were no signs of a struggle, no personal belongings out of place, nothing to indicate that anything unusual had happened. As he made his way to the bedroom, Simon felt a chill run down his spine. The room was cold, far colder than the rest of the house, and the air felt heavy, almost oppressive. He noticed something strange, shadows that didn't seem to belong. They flickered along the walls, moving even though there was no light to cast them. Simon's heart raced as he stepped closer to the bed. There, on the floor, was a single item, a book, its pages yellowed with age. He picked it up, flipping through the brittle pages. It appeared to be a journal, filled with scrawled handwriting that was barely legible. The entries were strange, rambling about shadows and voices in the dark. Mrs. Cartwright had written about seeing figures at the edge of her vision, shadows that moved on their own, whispering her name. The last entry was the most chilling. "They've come for me. I can hear them outside the door. I don't know how much time I have left. The shadows are alive. They want me." Suddenly, a loud thump echoed through the house. Simon's heart jumped into his throat. He spun around, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The shadows on the walls seemed to shift, growing darker, more distinct. He could feel something watching him, something lurking just beyond the edge of the light. The thump came again, louder this time, from the hallway. Simon's breath quickened as he stepped out of the bedroom, his flashlight flickering. The shadows moved with him, twisting and writhing like living things. His hands trembled as he followed the sound, every instinct telling him to turn and leave, but something compelled him to press on. As he reached the top of the stairs, the air grew colder still. The shadows converged, swirling together, forming a dark mass at the bottom of the stairs. Simon froze, his heart hammering in his chest. The darkness seemed to pulse, a low, guttural sound emanating from within. And then the shadows moved. They surged up the stairs, reaching for him with tendrils of darkness. Simon stumbled back, his flashlight flickering out. He fumbled in the darkness, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He could feel them, cold, suffocating, wrapping around him, pulling him down. Simon screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the shadows. They consumed him, dragging him into the dark. When the neighbors found Simon's car the next day, they assumed he had left. But inside Mrs. Cartwright's house, there was no sign of him. Only the journal, lying open on the floor, with a single new entry scrawled across the page. "They've taken him. The shadows have taken him, just like they took me." The house on Enoch Street remains empty to this day, its windows dark and lifeless. But if you listen closely on a quiet night, you might hear the whispers of those who have been lost to the shadows, calling out for someone to join them.